There is a man somewhere in the Israeli intelligence system who has never spoken publicly about what happened in Tehran in the spring of 2003. He has no biography, no confirmed photograph, no official record that acknowledges what he agreed to do. What he agreed to do was be buried alive in an enemy capital for 3 days, with one exit condition, a single shot at a single man, and no guaranteed way out. His name, for the purposes of this account, is Yakov. And before we go any further, there is one detail about this operation that changes everything once you know it. A detail that Yakov himself didn't discover until hour 61 of 72. We'll get there. But first, you need to understand the man they sent him to kill. Most people who think about Israeli intelligence and Iran think about nuclear scientists. They think about explosions on highways, about remote-controlled weapons, about the names that made international headlines. Reza Mottomdi made no headlines. That was the point of him. Mottomdi was not a general. He did not appear at military parades. He did not give speeches about the destruction of Israel or the will of the revolution. He attended funerals. That was how he worked. That was, in a very specific and operational sense, what made him one of the most dangerous men in the Islamic Republic to Israeli intelligence interests. He was a mid-senior coordinator inside the IRGC's internal security apparatus. His specific function was counterintelligence, the identification and neutralization of foreign human intelligence assets operating inside Iran. And for roughly 4 years before this operation was even conceived, he had been systematically destroying Mossad's network from the inside out. He didn't do it through dramatic raids or public arrests. He did it quietly. He observed patterns. He cross-referenced anomalies. He noticed the things that didn't fit, the slight behavioral changes in people near sensitive facilities, the financial irregularities that suggested outside payments, the social connections that mapped onto known foreign intelligence profiles. Over those 4 years, at least 11 Mossad-linked assets inside Iran had been exposed under his watch. Not all at once. 1 here, 2 there, a disappearance, an execution, a safe house that went dark without explanation. The kind of attrition that doesn't generate a single crisis moment. It just gradually empties the room. By late 2002, Mossad's operational infrastructure inside Iran was in serious deterioration. 3 separate cell structures had gone silent. 2 local assets had been executed after closed proceedings that Iran never publicized. 1 had simply vanished. No body, no trial record, nothing. The assessment at senior levels was clinical and alarming. If the current rate of exposure continued, Israel's human intelligence capability inside Iran, the capability that provided early warning on nuclear developments, missile programs, and planned external operations, would be functionally neutralized within 3 years. 3 years is a short timeline when you are talking about a country actively developing weapons that your government has publicly said it will not allow to exist. Mottomdi was the architect of that attrition, and Mossad had decided he needed to be removed. The decision to remove someone and the ability to do it are 2 entirely different problems. Mottomdi had survived inside Iranian counterintelligence long enough to be professionally paranoid. He did not keep a fixed home. He rotated between residences. He changed vehicles constantly and unpredictably. He had no public-facing role that required him to appear at scheduled events, give interviews, or attend official functions where external surveillance could build a reliable pattern. His security detail varied in size and composition depending on the day. Sometimes he moved with 3 men, sometimes with 1. Sometimes, apparently, alone. There was no consistency an outside observer could exploit with confidence. 3 separate planning efforts had tried to model a viable approach to him, and had each concluded that the operational environment didn't support a clean execution option. A vehicle ambush required predictable routes. He had none. A local asset engagement was rejected because the local network was compromised to an unknown degree, and using a potentially turned asset for a job of this sensitivity was assessed as a potential trap, not a solution. What Mossad's analysts kept returning to was a single behavioral constant in an otherwise unpredictable man. Once per year, on the anniversary of his father's death, Mottomdi visited Behesht-e Zahra, Tehran's largest cemetery. He came in the morning hours. He stayed for 30 to 40 minutes. He came with either one security escort or, in 2 observed instances, alone. This was a private act, a personal ritual, and because of that it was conducted without the full protective infrastructure he used everywhere else. 1 day per year. 1 predictable window in 365 days. 1 location where a man who was otherwise invisible became, briefly, findable. The question was how to get a shooter close enough to use it. Behesht-e Zahra is not a place where you improvise. It covers more than 4.5 square kilometers on Tehran's southern edge. It processes millions of visitors per year. It has multiple entry checkpoints. The sections dedicated to IRGC martyrs of the Iran-Iraq War are among the most politically sensitive ground in the entire country. And those sections are not far from where Mottomdi's father was buried. Security presence in the surrounding areas is elevated, not because of any specific threat awareness, but because of institutional habit. The cemetery is watched. It is logged. It is a place where anomalies get noticed by people whose job is to notice anomalies. A rooftop position at range had been assessed and eliminated. The surrounding urban architecture doesn't support it. Any elevated position within effective range would require days of pre-established presence in a city where patterns are monitored, where unfamiliar faces in residential proximity to sensitive locations get reported, and where Mottomdi's own counterintelligence apparatus actively surveilled areas around IRGC-connected facilities. An approach from a vehicle had been modeled and rejected. The checkpoint structure at the cemetery's primary entrances created controllable choke points. The probability of a clean vehicle exfiltration after an active shooting near those checkpoints had been assessed at under 20%, which left one option. The one nobody wanted: pre-positioning. Inside the cemetery itself, days in advance. The concept, in its outline, was simple. In its execution requirements, it was something else entirely. A single operative would need to enter the cemetery grounds before the anniversary date. Not the night before, days before. He would need to establish a concealed position inside the cemetery and maintain it without detection for up to 72 hours. He would need to execute 1 shot at 1 man on 1 morning under conditions that could not be fully predicted in advance. And then he would need to leave a cemetery that would, within minutes of that shot, become an active emergency scene with every exit under scrutiny. Every planning desk that reviewed this assessed the exfiltration component as the point at which the operation became operationally unsound. Not the insertion, not the concealment, the way out, because there wasn't a clean way out. Yakov read the file after 2 separate desks had rejected it. He proposed one change that the earlier planners hadn't modeled. He didn't propose extracting the shooter through the main routes at speed. He proposed using the post-shot chaos itself as the exfiltration environment. The immediate convergence of security personnel toward the interior of the cemetery, which would happen automatically and rapidly, would thin the perimeter. A secondary team, already in position outside the walls before the shot was taken, would be moving on a pre-agreed route before the scene had stabilized. It was not an elegant plan. It was a plan that required everything to happen in a specific sequence and gave the operative inside almost no ability to adapt if the sequence broke. The proposal went up the chain. It came back approved with one condition. The operative had to volunteer. This could not be assigned. Yakov put his name on it. What he did not know, and what no one in the planning cycle had fully accounted for, was that the intelligence about Mottomdi's arrival time was based on 3 years of surveillance. 3 years of one specific pattern, in one specific set of conditions. Patterns are not guarantees, and Mottomdi, in the spring of 2003, was not going to arrive alone. The preparation took 4 months. Not 4 months of waiting, 4 months of construction, fabrication, and cover building so layered that by the time Yakov entered Iran, he was not Yakov. He was a Hungarian cultural heritage researcher with a university affiliation, a hotel booking, a camera, and a documented history of interest in Persian architectural preservation. The identity had been built backward from the destination. Every detail existed to answer the first question Iranian border security would ask, and the second question they wouldn't ask out loud. He crossed through a third country transit point. His luggage was clean. His Farsi was functional but intentionally imperfect. A man who had studied the language academically, not one who had grown up with it. His cover had a built-in explanation for any linguistic gaps, and that explanation was itself a layer of protection. He checked into his hotel in central Tehran. He left twice on documented purposes: a site visit to a registered heritage location, a meal at a restaurant where a receipt would exist. He returned each time. He behaved like someone who had nothing to hide, which is not the same as having nothing to hide, but which produces, to an outside observer, a nearly identical profile. On the second night, he did not return. The rifle had arrived weeks before he did. It had entered the country in pieces, broken down beyond recognition as a weapon, and distributed across 3 separate shipments inside ceramic tile samples contained in a commercial freight consignment. The components had been held at a prearranged location by a technical support asset, a man who knew his role was logistics and who had learned, through years of working adjacent to operations he was never fully briefed on, not to ask what the components were for. The weapon itself was a bolt-action precision system chambered in 7.62 mm. The caliber choice was deliberate, not selected for maximum range, but for minimum acoustic profile. A suppressed 7.62 shot at under 400 meters in daylight, with ambient city noise and the presence of other visitors in the cemetery, would not register as a gunshot to untrained ears. It would register as something else: a car door, a piece of heavy equipment, a sound that the mind categorizes and moves past. The scope had been pre-calibrated for the expected environmental conditions. Morning light coming from the east, mild spring temperature, wind assessment based on 3 years of meteorological data for that specific location and that specific calendar period. 3 years of data. That detail will matter later. The concealment structure was the most operationally sensitive component of the entire operation, and it had been constructed by one man who was not told what it was. His name is not on record in any document that has been made public. For the purposes of this account, he was a Tehran-based technical contractor, a man who had worked the margins of multiple intelligence-adjacent jobs over a number of years, who understood that certain requests came with certain conditions of silence, and who had, on this occasion, been told that he was constructing a concealed storage cavity beneath a registered burial plot, a smuggling cache, a dead-drop physical infrastructure of the kind that exists in every major intelligence operational environment. He was good at his work. The cavity was 1.9 meters long, approximately 60 centimeters wide, and 80 centimeters deep. The ceiling was a reinforced panel disguised as the base layer of a grave marker slab, removable from below with a specific sequence of pressure points. 2 lateral ventilation channels ran through the soil to open-air positions behind permanent grave structures to either side. Enough airflow to sustain extended occupation, not enough room to fully extend both arms simultaneously. He built it in a single overnight session. He was paid in cash. He left Tehran within 48 hours of completing the work. He believed he had built a smuggling cache. He had actually built the most operationally exposed hide an intelligence operative had agreed to occupy since methods of this type were first documented. Yakov entered the cavity at 3:40 in the morning, 73 hours before the target window. The logistics of those 73 hours had been modeled, tested, and then modeled again. Food for 4 days. Water for 4 days. A sealed waste management system that required a level of biological self-management that training only partially prepares a person for. A low-power radio receiver, receive only, no transmission capability, that would relay one of 2 coded signal patterns from the external support team. One pattern meant proceed. A different pattern meant abort. No transmission meant nothing had changed, which could mean everything was fine. Or it could mean the team had lost the ability to reach him. He had no way to ask which. He settled into the darkness. He regulated his breathing. He waited. At hour 11, the first signal check window passed without a transmission. This was expected. The check windows were not continuous. They were scheduled at specific intervals to minimize any electromagnetic footprint. Silence at hour 11 was normal. At hour 14, the external surveillance team's secondary vehicle, the one covering the cemetery's western perimeter, experienced a mechanical failure. The vehicle could not be immediately replaced without a movement that would have been inconsistent with the established cover pattern for that position. The team maintained visual coverage on the primary checkpoint, but lost direct observation of the maintenance access points on the western side. Yakov didn't know this. The external team didn't know, at that point, whether it mattered. At hour 22, a groundskeeping worker making his routine morning pass through the civilian burial sections noticed a slight soil irregularity near the newly registered plot. Not a collapse, not an obvious disturbance, the kind of subtle unevenness that a man who has worked in a cemetery for years notices because he has looked at disturbed soil 10,000 times, and his eye has been trained by repetition to register when something is slightly wrong. He made a note in his maintenance log. He intended to return and inspect it more closely the following morning. The external team, whose coverage of the western perimeter had been compromised by the vehicle failure, did not observe the worker or the notation. They did not know a log entry had been made. No abort signal was sent. Yakov, inside the cavity at hour 22, registered footsteps above him for the first time. Not the maintenance worker, a morning visitor to an adjacent grave. Slow, unhurried steps. A pause. The particular quality of stillness that a person has when they are standing in grief rather than moving with purpose. He slowed his breathing to a rate that required active concentration to maintain. He did not move. He kept his eyes open because closing them, he had found in training, created a psychological effect that amplified sound and made stillness harder, not easier. The footsteps moved away after several minutes. He cataloged the event internally as a mourner, a civilian. No threat. He was correct about the civilian classification. He was not correct about the absence of threat. The maintenance worker would return the following morning. At hour 30, Yakov's operational picture was intact. No abort signal, no confirmed security awareness, concealment structure holding, physical condition within acceptable parameters. The target window was 43 hours away. From inside the cavity, the operation was proceeding as planned. This is the gap between what an operative can know and what is actually true. The maintenance worker returned the following morning, as he had intended. He found the soil disturbance was still present, slightly more pronounced now, which was a consequence of the natural settling of the cavity structure over time, a detail the technical assessment had not fully accounted for. He made a second notation in his log. He decided to report it to his supervisor before proceeding with any physical inspection. His supervisor was not available until the afternoon. The report sat. Outside the cemetery, the external support team had recovered vehicle coverage of the western perimeter. They had not recovered the information about the maintenance log because they had no visibility into internal cemetery administrative communications. To their observation, the environment was clean. In their scheduled transmission window, they sent the proceed signal. Yakov received it at hour 31. He interpreted it as full confirmation that the operational environment was clear. It was not full confirmation. It was confirmation that the team's observable picture was clear. Those are not the same thing, and the distinction between them was about to become the structural fault line running underneath the entire operation. At hour 31, Yakov also made his first incorrect assumption. He had been modeling the shot in his head with the regularity that trained shooters use to maintain readiness during extended static periods, running the sequence, the position adjustment, the breath control, the trigger pull. In doing this, he had been working from the calibration data built into the scope: morning light, mild temperature, east-facing angle. He had also been assuming, based on 3 years of surveillance data, that Mottomdi would arrive between 9 and 10:30 in the morning. This assumption governed everything about the shot setup: the angle of light, the expected wind behavior, the crowd density in the section at that hour, which the earlier surveillance had shown to be relatively low on weekday mornings. He had not seriously modeled the scenario in which Mottomdi arrived later. Not because he was careless. Because 3 years of consistent pattern data creates a gravitational pull toward certainty that is difficult to consciously resist. The pattern had held every time it had been observed. The assumption felt like a fact. It was not a fact, it was a frequency, and frequency is not destiny. At hour 37, Yakov became aware that something in his physiological baseline was shifting. Not dramatically, not in a way that signaled medical risk, but the sustained sensory deprivation of the hide, the darkness, the constrained physical space, the absence of any external reference point beyond the sounds filtering through the ventilation channels, was beginning to do something specific to his sense of time. Hours were expanding. 37 hours of elapsed time felt like substantially more. The mental discipline required to maintain accurate internal timekeeping was increasing in cost. He was compensating, using a technique he had been trained on. But compensation is not elimination. He was also aware, in the particular way that experienced operatives become aware of things they cannot immediately verify, that something in his environment had changed. He could not name what it was. He ran through the variables he could assess. Temperature unchanged. Airflow through the ventilation channels normal. No footsteps above him in the current window. Radio receiver silent, which meant either no transmission was due or the transmission had occurred and something had prevented him from receiving it. That last possibility sat in the corner of his thinking and did not move. He had no way to investigate it. He had no way to transmit. He had no way to know whether the silence was routine or whether something outside this cavity had already broken in a direction he couldn't see. The target window was now 36 hours away, and for the first time since insertion, Yakov was not certain the operation he was lying inside was the same operation that had been approved. The target window opened at 9 o'clock in the morning. Yakov had been awake for the previous 6 hours with the particular quality of wakefulness that has nothing to do with alertness and everything to do with the inability to drift. Not anxious wakefulness. Operational wakefulness. The kind where the body has accepted that sleep is no longer relevant and has reorganized itself around a single coming requirement. At 8:40, he began the transition from static concealment to pre-fire position. This was the most physically demanding 20 minutes of the entire 72-hour operation, not because the movements were large, but because they were microscopic. Every adjustment had to be made within the constraints of the cavity's dimensions, without producing vibration detectable at the surface, without shifting the ceiling panel in any way that would alter the soil profile visible above him. He had rehearsed this sequence for 4 months. He had rehearsed it in a constructed replica of the hide at a facility outside Tel Aviv. He had rehearsed it until the sequence was muscular, not cognitive. But rehearsal happens without 71 hours of prior static occupation. Rehearsal happens without the particular physical compression that accumulates in the joints and connective tissue over 3 days of constrained positioning. When he began the transition, the first thing he registered was that his left shoulder, which had been bearing a specific load for an extended period, was not responding with the precision the sequence required. He stopped. He waited 4 minutes. He applied pressure to the joint in a specific pattern. He began again. The second attempt moved more cleanly, but it cost him time. At 9:03, he was in pre-fire position, 3 minutes behind the window opening. 3 minutes is not a large number. In a static surveillance and assassination operation with a target who had historically spent 30 to 40 minutes at the location, 3 minutes was operationally insignificant. He told himself this. He believed it. He was also aware that he was telling himself this, and that awareness created a thin layer of doubt underneath the belief that he could not fully dissolve. He raised the rifle port at 9:05 and began scanning the confirmed approach route. The section was visible. The approach path from the main civilian entrance corridor was clear. There were 11 other visitors in the observable area, mourners, most of them, moving with the particular purposeful slowness of people who know exactly which grave they are walking toward. 2 groundskeeping staff were visible at the far edge of the section. He scanned the approach. Empty of the target. This was not alarming at 9:05. The surveillance data showed a window of 900 to 10:30. He was inside the window. He held the position. He breathed. He waited. At 9:40, the approach route was still empty of the target. He recalibrated his interpretation of the window. 10:30 was the outer edge of the historical range, not a hard limit. The target had arrived within the earlier portion of the window in 2 of the 3 observed instances, and within the later portion once. The sample size was 3. 3 observations do not define a pattern with the kind of certainty that the planning documents had implied. He was aware, at 9:40, that he was in the process of mentally restructuring the intelligence picture to accommodate what was in front of him. He was also aware that this was a specific cognitive risk, the tendency to reinterpret data to fit a preferred operational outcome rather than to read it cleanly. He stopped restructuring. He simply watched. At 10:15, a man entered the approach route from the main corridor. The profile matched. Height, build, approximate age, the particular way Mottomdi carried his weight that the surveillance photographs had captured. Yakov's body made the shift before his mind fully confirmed it. Breathing slowed. The scope picture steadied. He tracked the figure for 40 meters along the approach path. At 40 meters, the man turned east toward a different grave section entirely. Not the target. Yakov held the position. He did not move. He recalibrated without expression. The window was still open, 10:15, 75 minutes remaining in the historical range. At 10:30, the outer edge of the documented window passed. He did not move. This was the first decision point that the operations planning had not explicitly addressed. The abort protocol was transmitted externally. He couldn't initiate it. The proceed signal was equally external. He was lying in a sealed cavity in a cemetery in Tehran with a rifle and a target who had not appeared, and the sum total of his decision-making authority in this moment was whether to remain in position or to begin the abort sequence unilaterally. Unilateral abort meant moving. Moving meant producing vibration and potential surface disturbance during what were now the higher traffic hours of the cemetery's morning period. Unilateral abort without an external signal meant making a decision that the planning structure had deliberately not placed in his hands. He remained. He told himself he would remain until 11:30, and then begin the unilateral abort sequence regardless of signal status. He told himself this with the kind of internal firmness that functions as a commitment, but that he also understood, at some level, was provisional in a way that actual commitments are not. 11:30 came. He did not begin the abort sequence. He remained. The light had shifted. The morning's east-facing angle was giving way to the flatter, harder quality of midday light. The shot had been calibrated for morning. Midday light at this location and this compass orientation produced a different profile, not dramatically different, but different enough that the pre-calculated ballistic data required mental adjustment. The kind of adjustment that is entirely manageable under normal conditions, and that under the conditions of hour 72 in a sealed cavity, he was performing with less margin than he would have preferred. He was also aware that the wind had shifted, not dramatically, but the data he was working from had been built on morning meteorological patterns. It was no longer morning. At 12:40, a figure entered the approach route. The height was right. The build was right. The particular distribution of weight that the surveillance material had documented, right. And beside him, holding his arm, walking 2 steps to his left, was a woman. 40 years old, approximately. The age of an adult daughter. The posture of someone who was present not as security but as family, leaning slightly toward him, not scanning outward, engaged in conversation. The operational mandate had one absolute constraint. 1. No secondary casualties. Yakov tracked them through the scope as they moved along the approach path toward the grave. He ran the geometry continuously. The woman was on the left. The target moved in a pattern that kept her close. They were not separating. He did not take the shot. They reached the grave. The target knelt. The woman remained standing, 2 steps behind him and to the left, almost directly in the line. He tracked. He waited. He assessed the geometry every 3 seconds. For 11 minutes, there was no clean line. This was the near-abort moment. Not a dramatic one, not a moment of visible crisis, but the quiet functional equivalent of an operation that cannot execute. A target present, in range, in acceptable light despite the midday shift, with a confirmed identification, and no viable shot because a woman who did not know she was saving her father's life was standing in the wrong place. At minute 11, she walked. Not far, 30 meters toward the edge of the section where a small vendor cart was positioned near the path junction. Flowers, small ceremonial items, the kind of peripheral commerce that exists at the edges of large cemeteries everywhere. She moved away from him. Her back was turned. The geometry opened. This is the false release moment, and it deserves to be understood precisely. For approximately 4 seconds after she began walking, before Yakov had settled into the shot, the scene had the quality of a problem that had resolved itself. The target was kneeling. The line was clear. The woman was moving away and had not looked back. Other visitors in the section were not in the line. The operational requirement was met. For 4 seconds, it felt like the hard part was over. Then the target began to stand. A man rising from a kneeling position in the act of grief does not do it quickly. He does it in stages. He places one hand on the grave marker. He shifts his weight. He begins to rise. The head and upper body travel through multiple positions during the process of standing. None of them as stable as the kneeling position. None of them offering the same quality of target presentation. Yakov had approximately 8 seconds of optimal target window if the target moved from kneeling to fully standing at a normal pace. 8 seconds between the moment the line was clear and the moment the target would either be fully standing, a harder shot geometry, or would have turned to follow his daughter. He settled the breath. He ran the adjusted ballistic calculation for the shifted wind and the midday light deviation. He made one final scope adjustment. He took the shot. The shot hit, 1 round, 340 meters, suppressed. Mottomdi went down between 2 grave rows with the particular finality of a body that has stopped being a person and become a weight. For the first 18 seconds after the shot, nothing happened. Not nothing in the sense of calm, nothing in the sense that the scene had not yet processed what it contained. 2 visitors in the adjacent row had registered a sound, not a gunshot in their immediate interpretation. Something else. The mind's first offer is always the most benign available explanation, and their minds offered them something industrial, something distant, something that did not require them to act. Mottomdi's daughter was facing away, holding a paper-wrapped cluster of flowers, waiting for a vendor to make change. She did not hear the shot. She did not see her father fall. For 18 seconds, she was standing 30 meters away from a man who was already dead, and she did not know it. Those 18 seconds were the false release. The operation had executed. The line had been clean. The shot had connected. In 18 seconds of ambient cemetery stillness, it was possible to believe, inside a sealed cavity 340 meters away, that the hard architecture of the operation had held. Then, one of the 2 visitors who had paused began to move toward the grave rows. He saw Mottomdi on the ground. He did not immediately understand what he was seeing. A fallen man, face down, between grave markers could be a medical event, could be a collapse. He called out. No response. He stepped closer. He saw the blood. He shouted. The response was not instantaneous, but it was fast. Cemetery security, 2 personnel near the martyrs section, 1 near the central corridor, moved inward toward the disturbance within approximately 90 seconds of the shout. Their movement was instinctive and institutional, the same convergence pattern that security personnel produce in any emergency toward the source quickly, with the perimeter as a secondary concern. The perimeter thinned. Yakov had modeled this. He had lain in this cavity for 62 hours precisely because this thinning was the only viable exfiltration window the operation had. He waited. He began collapsing the rifle port at minute 2. He sealed the cavity's equipment in the designated sequence. At minute 38, he began the exit sequence, the slow, controlled reversal of the insertion process, producing no surface disturbance, no sound above the ambient noise of a site that was now generating significant human activity 200 meters away. He emerged at minute 41. He was dressed in the clothing of a civilian mourner, dark, unremarkable, consistent with the demographic profile of the section's typical visitor. He moved without urgency. Urgency is visible, purposeful grief is not. The external contact reached him 60 meters from the western maintenance exit. No words, a jacket exchanged. A direction indicated by the angle of a turned shoulder. He was outside the cemetery wall at minute 46. He was in a vehicle heading north at minute 49. The operation's execution phase had ended. What came next was not the operation ending. It was the operation becoming something else. The maintenance log still existed. 2 entries, 2 mornings. A groundskeeper who had noticed a soil irregularity near a newly registered plot and had written it down because that is what a conscientious worker does. The entries had not generated a security response before the operation executed. They had not needed to. But after the assassination, with Iranian investigators sweeping the entire site for forensic and administrative evidence of how an IRGC counterintelligence figure had been shot in a public cemetery in broad daylight, that maintenance log became one of the most examined documents in the inquiry. The log led to the plot registration. The registration led to the forged documentation chain. The documentation chain led, slowly, over months, through the particular patients that Iranian intelligence applied to this investigation, to the procurement trail of the cavity's construction materials. That trail led to a man who had built something he believed was a smuggling cache. 14 months after the operation, the technical contractor was arrested. He was tried in a closed proceeding. The Iranian judiciary's treatment of individuals convicted of cooperation with Israeli intelligence has been consistent and documented. He was executed in 2005. He had not known what he was building. This fact was presented during his proceedings. It did not change the outcome. The decision to use a local technical asset rather than importing the construction capability, a decision made on operational security grounds, the correct decision by standard tradecraft logic, had created a liability that outlived the operation by 2 years and cost a man his life for work he had understood to be entirely different from what it was. This is not an unusual feature of covert operations. It is a structural one. The local asset absorbs the residual risk that the operation cannot carry out with it when it leaves. The operative goes home. The asset stays in the environment. These facts coexist in every planning document and are understood by everyone involved, and the understanding does not change the outcome for the person it concerns most. Mottomdi's counterintelligence program did not die with him. This had been understood in the planning assessment, and it was confirmed in the years following. The program continued under new leadership, reassigned to a senior IRGC intelligence officer who had worked adjacent to Mottomdi's apparatus for several years. The transition produced a gap, a period of approximately 22 months during which the program operated at reduced effectiveness while institutional knowledge was reconstructed and methodologies were updated. For Mossad, that gap was valuable. It was the operational objective translated into practical terms. New cell structures were established inside Iran during that window. Existing assets who had gone quiet were carefully reactivated. The intelligence pipeline that had been deteriorating, the one whose deterioration had made this operation necessary, was partially rebuilt. Partially, not fully. The exposures that Mottomdi had already generated were permanent. 11 assets burned, 2 executed, safe houses gone, networks restructured. The damage he had done was not undone by his removal. His removal stopped the bleeding. It did not replace the blood. By 2006, Iran's internal counterintelligence function had largely recovered its operational capacity. The new leadership had, if anything, expanded the scope of the program. And the investigation into Mottomdi's assassination had produced something with longer-term consequences than the program interruption. It had produced a new institutional awareness. Behesht-e-Zahra was never the same operationally, in the sense that it became a studied case inside Iranian security culture. The discovery of the cavity, the finding that a pre-positioned hide had been constructed inside the cemetery and occupied for 3 days before the killing, fundamentally changed how Iranian security thought about the physical environment of sensitive sites. Not just cemeteries, gardens, public markets, heritage locations, any place where foreigners had legitimate access, where ground could be worked without immediate scrutiny, and where a pre-positioned asset could establish a presence that surveillance would not detect because it preceded surveillance. New protocols were developed. Maintenance logs became security documents, not administrative ones. Soil disturbance reports near sensitive sections were escalated to security personnel rather than groundskeeping supervisors. Burial plot registrations within defined perimeters were cross-checked against wider intelligence databases before administrative approval. These protocols did not exist before Behesht-e-Zahra. They exist now. Every future Mossad operation in Iran that contemplated a pre-positioning approach had to account for a security layer that this operation had created by succeeding. The tradecraft that worked once became the vulnerability that was closed specifically because it had worked. That is the pattern that runs underneath the history of intelligence operations between Israel and Iran, each successful method generating the countermeasure that eliminates it. Yakov returned to Israel on the same Hungarian passport he had entered on. He filed his debrief over several sessions. He took medical leave. The physical recovery from 72 hours of cavity occupation was not dramatic. There was no acute injury, no single medical event, but the body accounts for what it has been through in slower and less linear ways than incident reporting requires. He went back to work. There is no public record of what he did afterward. That is consistent with the kind of work he was doing. And it is the only confirmation of anything that this account can honestly offer. The man he was sent to kill has never been officially named by Iran as an assassination victim. The official position, maintained in the years following, was a medical event. A man who died while visiting his father's grave. His daughter was 30 meters away, holding flowers when he was shot. That detail is not in any official record. It is part of the operational record that exists in the gap between what governments acknowledge and what happened. She didn't know what the sound was. She didn't know for several seconds that he had fallen. Then she did. That is where the operation ends if you measure it by the shot. If you measure it by what it set in motion, the contractor's arrest 14 months later, the security protocols that were rewritten, the intelligence window that opened and then closed, the investigation that is probably still somewhere in an Iranian archive, then it hasn't ended. These operations don't end. They extend into consequences that outlast the operatives, the planners, and sometimes the organizations that ran them. The cemetery is still there, the maintenance logs are still filed, the protocols are still in place, and somewhere in an Israeli intelligence record that will not be declassified in any of our lifetimes, there is a file with Yakov's name on it, or whatever name belongs to the man who spent 3 days in the ground to take one shot, that describes all of this in the language of assessments and outcomes and operational parameters. It will not describe what it cost. That never makes it into the file. If you came this far into this operation, you already know what this channel is about. Subscribe to Hidden Ops. A new operation every week, no noise, just the work.